My name's Tim Byard-Jones. I've been playing gamelan since 1985. I'm a veteran of the Indonesian government's Dharma Siswa scholarship scheme. I'm now working as a journalist in Reading, and I run a gamelan group called Kampung Reading, which is a mixture of Indonesian people living in this area and British players.
Tim, when did you hear gamelan for the first time?
The very first time I ever heard gamelan was in 1985. I was a student at the time. I was studying music at the University of Oxford, and I was with a chamber choir that did a Far East tour. And one of the places we went was Jakarta. We were singing in a complex called Taman Ismail Marzuki, which you doubtless come across. And before I went to Indonesia, I was 20 years old, I knew next to nothing about Indonesia. You've probably heard this from other people. Certainly at that time, in the 1980s, most British people didn't have a very clear idea of where Indonesia was, what it was like. My sort of mental database went Indonesia, country in Southeast Asia, capital Jakarta, other information, don't know. And that was about it. And I think that was typical for the time in many ways. Anyway, we went to Indonesia choir, and they're very friendly, very welcoming. It was a wonderful experience. And we were given a break in the middle of rehearsals in the afternoon in Taman Ismail Marzuki, and I went outside.
You were performing gamelan?
No, we were performing Western music, singing as a choir. I'd never seen a gamelan before. And I walked outside and heard this strange sound I'd never heard before, and sort of followed, walked between the buildings until I'd tracked where this was coming from. And I came to the end of a hall. The whole end of the hall was open. And there was a line of little girls about maybe 10 years old having a dance class. And along the side of the room was a live gamelan playing for the dance class. And I just kind of stood there. It was like almost like a sort of religious conversion experience. Because here was something I'd never heard before. I was already quite an experienced musician. I mean, I was studying music in university and singing sort of semi-professionally. I'd never come across this music before. It was clear straight away that this was something as developed and as sophisticated as Western classical music, and I didn't understand it. It was like seeing a play performed in a language that you don't speak. You can see that something is going on, some very high culture, some really meaningful stuff going on here, but you don't actually understand the words. And that was a life-changing moment. Those couple of minutes I just stood there, astounded by this dance class. And I knew that that's something I really wanted to. I wanted to learn this language. I wanted to understand what was going on in this culture. I was very lucky. I was far luckier than I had any right to be, because at almost the same time as we were in Indonesia, my university, the University of Oxford, was given a gamelan by the Indonesian Ministry of Forestry. This was 85, summer of 1985. And again, I'm sure there are other people who'll tell you more about the sort of later history of the Oxford gamelan. So when I got back to Oxford, there was a gamelan newly arrived in the music faculty, and they'd arranged a teacher who was a guy called Alec Roth, who I'm sure he's also going to be somewhere in this. So he was my first gamelan teacher when I got back to Oxford, and I spent a year going to every gamelan event I could. And in those days, there were very few gamelan groups in the country. The Indonesian embassy had a gamelan, but only Indonesian embassy staff were playing it. There was a gamelan at the University of York with Neil Sorrel in charge. There was the Durham University Gamelan, there was Cambridge, and there was the Oxford group that I was a sort of founder member of. And whenever there was a gamelan concert or teaching event anywhere in the country, people would sort of pile into cars or get on the train, travel hundreds of miles to be at any gamelan event that was going. Another person who was very important at that stage was a guy called Joko Parwanto, who was the musician in residence at the Indonesian embassy in London. And he used to come and teach gamelan weekends at Oxford and Cambridge. And at the end of that first year of playing, there was a week-long summer school in Oxford. And Pat Joko was one of the teachers there. And he sort of came to me at the end of the week and said, you know, you seem to be very keen on learning more about gamelan. I said, yes, I am. And you're doing quite well at it. And I said, thank you very much. He said, would you be interested in getting a scholarship to go to Indonesia and study? And the answer, of course, was yes, which I think I was on my knees at that point, going, yes, please. So he told me who to write to and get this organised. I was also extremely lucky at that point in that the curator of the Bake collection in Oxford, a guy called Jeremy Montague, who again was very sort of important in the early days of British Gamelan, great supporter of gamelan music in Britain. He offered me a job as assistant curator of the Bake collection. So I had a day job sort of in a museum with the gamelan, so I could practice if there was nobody in there. And managed to get the scholarship arranged. And in... excuse me. Okay.
Oh.
It's okay, don't worry. We can edit that out. So in October 1988, eventually it was, I went out to Institut Sen Indonesia in Yogyakarta. Now, by that point, a couple of other interesting things had happened. One was that the Southbank Gamelan had arrived, and I was a founder member of that. It wasn't very organised in the early days. It kind of got going later. Some very energetic people behind it. But in the early days, it was, again, a case of people getting on buses. I used to commute for Sunday afternoon rehearsals from Oxford on the bus to London.
Your scholarship,
This was while I was waiting for the scholarship to come through. There was a bit of a gap. So I had a chance to sort of do an Indonesian language course and read as much as was then published about gamelan, which wasn't much really. But as I say, I was a founder member, and we did a wayang in early 1987 with the then ambassador to London, Pak Suhartoyo, who was a Javanese dalang. There was also, at that time, living in London, a guy called Ben Arps, who's now a professor at the University of Leiden, Javanese language and literature. And he was also a dalang. And his wife was a very, very competent Sinden as well, Byard-Jones. So they came across and taught as well. And I thought, well, very few people yet have been to Jogja. Everybody's been to Aski, as it then was, in Surakarta. So I'll be different, I'll go to Jogja. I also got very interested in wayang. So when I got there, I ended up taking sort of a split of Karawitan and Pedalangan. And I managed to blag 1 year scholarship into 2 years of actual study. Which, again, things seem to be a lot more organised today. In the 1980s, it was all very sort of improvised. the way everything, including the way the Dharma systems were organised, was all a bit improvised. For the first group, there were people coming from sort of all over the country. Anthony Milton came down from Cambridge. Neil Sorrell came down from York on the motorbike to do that. There's a lady called Maria Mendonça, who's now teaching at Wesleyan in the States, doing gamelan. Adrian Lee, composer, was playing. There were a few people who'd been on sort of various Southbank classes. Simon Cook was playing Gender. Other names will come back to me later, I'm sure. It's been a long time. So that was the sort of, yeah. So yeah, I did 2 years in Jogja. And then I came back just in time for the Island to Island Festival in 1990. That was in the Southbank. That was a big group of performers came over from ASCII, which may have been SDSE by that point in Surakarta.
Yeah.
So it was a big group of
So the
Solanese.
festival at Southbank.
Yeah.
Which year?
This was summer of 1990.
1990.
It was called Island to Island, which again was interesting because it was the first time there had been a big group of Indonesian performers, certainly in my experience. It may have been years before, but in my experience and involvement with Indonesian performing arts, that was the first time we had a complete, troupe, a complete package of musicians and dancers come over, rather than have to sort of struggle to do it ourselves, as we had before. So that was, again, was a very eye-opening as to the possibilities of what could be done. And by that point, I'd been in Java for 2 years, so I'd seen a lot of performances by then. But I think that was a big boost to the Southbank Gamelan program, because again, a lot of people who hadn't had the good fortune to go to Indonesia got sort of full-on blast of the possibilities of the music and the dance and the wayang and everything in one big package. The only sort of big performance that we'd had before then, I remember, was when the Dalang Ki Anom Suroto came over to perform. He went to various European countries and he sort of fitted in a couple of performances in London, including an all-night wayang in the Southbank Centre. That would have been around just before Christmas 1986. So again, these things kind of stick out, in my memory because they were rare, and again, you had these things going on, and there was such a demand for tickets with people coming from every gamelan group in the UK to, come and see the real thing being played. It reminds me in a way when I hear people, rock musicians who are talking about the sort of blues scene in Britain in the 1960s, where good American blues singers would come over and so everybody would be there to hear them. It was that kind of atmosphere. A good dalang is coming to London, everybody turns up to sort of sit there and soak in the atmosphere and see the real thing happening. They were wonderful experiences. I don't know, it wouldn't be possible to quantify, but if anybody has ever thought to work out how much money the Indonesian government has invested in performing arts around the world, and how much money has come back into Indonesia through tourism and study and all these things, because I think I'm biased, but I think it's a wonderful investment in not just in sort of financial terms, but in sort of the image of the country and cultural exchange and the way that the country's viewed.